Picture this. You're standing in a marble hall the size of a football stadium, steam curling up toward a ceiling painted with goths, and everyone around you, senators, dock workers, sex workers, soldiers, off-duty legionaries, is naked. Not awkward naked, casual naked, like it's Tuesday, because it is Tuesday. And this exact scene is the part of Roman history your textbooks skipped to talk about aqueducts instead. Here's the thing about the baths of Caracalla, finished around 216 CE, built to hold roughly 1,600 people at once. Your textbook probably showed you a black and white photo of the ruins, some broken columns, some grass growing through cracked mosaic, and called it a public bathing facility. Cute. Technically true. Also almost insultingly incomplete. Because what actually happened inside those walls wasn't just hygiene.
It was Rome's entire social operating system, running in the nude 6 days a week for 600 years, in a building so enormous that modern visitors to the ruins near the Circus Maximus still crane their necks trying to picture the roof that used to be there. By the end of this, you're going to look at every Roman ruin differently. Because we've been handed the architecture and stripped of the culture. Let's fix that. The building itself, or this thing, was genuinely massive. Start with scale, because numbers don't lie even when historians get squeamish. The baths of Caracalla covered about 25 hectares. That's roughly 62 acres, bigger than some American high schools, plus their entire parking lots combined. Inside, a frigidarium for cold plunges, a tepidarium for lukewarm lounging, a caldarium heated by an underground furnace system called the hypocaust, where enslaved workers shoveled wood into furnaces so hot the floor tiles above could burn bare feet if you stood still too long. Below ground ran a labyrinth of service tunnels wide enough for ox carts hauling firewood, invisible to bathers upstairs who never had to see the labor keeping their feet warm. They were libraries, 2 of them, one Greek, one Latin, with shelving for scrolls carved directly into the walls. There were gymnasiums, gardens, an outdoor swimming pool called the natatio, roughly the length of an Olympic pool today, and enough marble imported from Egypt and Numidia that modern estimates put the cost in the tens of millions of dollars, adjusted. This wasn't a bathhouse. This was a mall, a gym, a library, a spa, and a social club stacked into one building, and admission cost about a quadrans, the cheapest coin in circulation, worth a fraction of a loaf of bread. Rome wanted everybody inside. Even the poorest citizen in the Subura slums could scrape together a quadrans and walk into a building dripping with imported marble. And when we say everybody, we mean everybody. Which is where it stops sounding like Pinterest and starts sounding interesting. A day at the baths, or what actually happened in there. Okay, so what did people actually do for the 4 or 5 hours they spent here most afternoons? First, exercise. The palestra, an open courtyard where men wrestled, threw weighted balls called harpasta, boxed with leather-wrapped knuckles that left permanent scars on the men who took it seriously. Then, oil. Attendants called unctores rubbed olive oil onto bathers' skin, then scraped it off with a curved bronze tool called a strigil, dragging off sweat, dirt, and dead skin in one motion. Archaeologists have pulled hundreds of these strigils out of the ground. They're some of the most common Roman artifacts we have, sitting in museum cases from London to Naples, which tells you something about how central this ritual was. Then the actual bathing sequence, cold, warm, hot, cold again, was basically Roman cardiovascular therapy. Pliny the Elder wrote about people who bathed obsessively, sometimes multiple times a day, and doctors of the era genuinely debated whether that was healthy or excessive, which honestly feels very modern, like reading a first-century argument about whether cold plunges are actually good for you or just a trend. But here's the wild part. The baths weren't quiet. Seneca, in one of his letters, complained about living above a bathhouse, describing the grunting of exercisers, the slap of massage, the shrieking of a man having his armpit hair plucked by a professional depilator, the splash of someone doing cannonballs into the pool, and vendors shouting to sell sausages and pastries. It was loud. It was social. It was, in a very real sense, the group chat of the ancient world, except everyone showed up in person, and nobody was wearing pants. The nudity, or, this is where your assumptions probably break, let's just address it directly because dancing around it does nobody any favors. Mixed-gender bathing existed in Rome, at least for stretches of its history, and full nudity was standard practice for men in most baths, most of the time. The Emperor Hadrian, ruling from 117 to 138 CE, actually tried to ban mixed bathing, which tells you it was common enough to need banning. Later, under Marcus Aurelius, some cities designated separate hours or separate baths for women, which again tells you the default before that was less separated than we assume. Some smaller bath complexes in provincial towns show architectural evidence of women's-only sections built later as add-ons, proof that the original design didn't always bother. Now, was this a sex-charged free-for-all? No. Don't let anyone tell you that. And honestly, this channel isn't going to tell you that either, because it's lazy history, and it flattens something more interesting. The nudity was communal, not necessarily erotic in intent, closer to how a modern European sauna operates than anything else. But Rome also wasn't shy about acknowledging bodies, beauty, and desire as normal features of public life, not shameful secrets to be hidden.
Graffiti found in Pompeii's bath complexes includes casual, sometimes crude commentary about specific bathers. Physical proto-Twitter, basically, scratched into plaster with a stylus, sometimes signed, sometimes anonymous. People noticed each other. People flirted. People definitely used the baths as a place to see and be seen, the same way a modern beach or gym functions today, just with significantly less spandex and considerably more steam. The class collision, or senators next to slaves. Here's what genuinely should blow your mind more than the nudity does: the social mixing. Roman society was brutally stratified. Patricians, plebeians, freedmen, enslaved people. This was not an egalitarian world in almost any other context. And yet, inside the baths, for a few hours a day, a senator might be scraped down by the same strigil-wielding attendant who served a dock worker an hour earlier. Both men equally wet, equally pink from the heat, equally annoyed at the guy hogging the plunge pool. The Emperor Commodus reportedly bathed among ordinary citizens, which ancient writers treated as either populist showmanship or genuinely scandalous behavior, depending on who was writing. A second-century equivalent of a head of state posting a gym selfie, and half the country losing their minds over it. This wasn't equality, let's not overstate it. Enslaved people were still there as laborers, not equals, tending furnaces in brutal heat, hauling water, scraping other people's skin for a living while nobody scraped theirs. And their comfort was never the point. But there was a leveling that happened nowhere else in Roman public life. A shared physical vulnerability. Everyone sweats. Everyone's wet hair sticks to their forehead. Everyone's stomach growls when the sausage vendor walks by. Scholars debate how much genuine social bonding this created versus how much it was performance, theater of accessibility from emperors wanting good press. Probably some of both. The health angle, or actually kind of a public health disaster. Now for the part documentaries love to skip because it's less romantic.
Roman baths, for all their marble grandeur, were not exactly sanitary by modern standards. The water in the large communal pools wasn't chlorinated, obviously. It was changed periodically, but not constantly, and hundreds of bodies shared the same water daily, floating hair and skin oil and whatever else humans shed. Ancient medical writers, including Galen, discussed skin conditions and infections that spread through bath culture. Some modern historians have pointed out that these baths may have functioned as accidental transmission sites for various ailments. Ironic, given they were marketed and understood as health institutions, prescribed by physicians for everything from joint pain to melancholy. There's also the fact that scraping oil and grime off with a shared strigil, or being tended by the same attendant who just handled someone else's skin, wasn't exactly a hygienic assembly line by today's standards. Rome believed deeply in the health benefits of bathing, and in some ways they were right, especially about the social and mental health value of communal ritual. But the actual bacterial reality was messier than the marble suggested. The wild part is often the actual historical record, and the actual record here is gorgeous architecture, genuinely questionable water quality. The sensual reputation, or why later centuries got obsessed. By the time we hit the 19th century, European and American painters were obsessed with Roman baths. Think Lawrence Alma-Tadema's lush, lounging bathhouse scenes, all soft light and reclining figures draped in silk that Romans themselves would have found impractical for actual bathing. But those Victorian paintings tell you more about Victorian repression and fantasy than about actual Rome. They took a communal hygiene and social institution and repainted it as a permanent erotic tableau, stripped of the sausage vendors and the shrieking depilation clients and the slave labor keeping furnaces burning, and replaced it with soft focus fantasy meant for a wealthy gallery patron in London, not a dock worker in Ostia. It's a distortion in the opposite direction from the sanitized textbook version. Instead of erasing the body, it over-sexualizes it into something Rome itself didn't quite present. The actual Roman attitude sat somewhere in the middle, comfortable with the body, matter-of-fact about nudity, occasionally flirtatious but fundamentally functional. A gym you attended before dinner, not a permanent bacchanal. The empire widespread, or this wasn't just Rome. And here's something worth sitting with for a second. This wasn't a Rome-only phenomenon. Bathhouses this size, built on the same hypocaust technology, show up from Bath in Roman Britain, yes, that's literally where the name comes from, all the way to North Africa and the eastern provinces around modern Turkey. The baths at Aquae Sulis in Britain, dedicated to a fused Roman-Celtic goddess, show worshippers dropping curse tablets into the sacred spring, thin sheets of lead scratched with complaints about stolen cloaks and unfaithful lovers. That's right. People used a bathhouse temple as a place to file supernatural lawsuits. The empire exported this ritual everywhere it went, which tells you it wasn't incidental to Roman identity. It was central to it. The decline, or why we forgot all this. So, what happened? Two things, really. First, practical collapse. As the Western Roman Empire fractured through the 5th century, the aqueduct systems feeding these massive complexes fell into disrepair. You can't run a hypocaust furnace system or fill a natatio without serious infrastructure, and infrastructure was the first thing to crumble when tax revenue dried up and armies stopped getting paid. Second, and more relevant to why we don't talk about this in school, a shifting moral framework. As Christianity became the dominant institutional force across the former empire, communal nudity and mixed bathing increasingly got recast as symbols of pagan decadence, moral laxity, the fall of Rome itself. Early Christian writers, including figures like Clement of Alexandria, expressed discomfort with public bathing culture, specifically because of its casual nudity. Over centuries, that discomfort hardened into doctrine, and doctrine hardened into the textbook version you got. Bathhouses as a footnote about hygiene, stripped of body, of noise, of social texture, of the sheer normalcy of communal nakedness. The pattern, or what this actually tells us. Here's the through line across all of this. Rome wasn't a sexual utopia, and it wasn't a puritanical fortress either. It was a society that built enormous, genuinely staggering public infrastructure around the idea that bodies are normal, that community happens through shared physical ritual, and that hygiene, exercise, and socializing didn't need to be separated into different buildings, different hours, different lives. Then, over centuries of empire collapse and religious transformation, that comfort got edited out. First, practically, as the buildings crumbled. Then morally, as new institutions rewrote what nakedness meant. What you were taught was the ruins. What actually happened was the noise, the oil, the steam, the senators and slaves in the same room, briefly, sweating. If this rewired anything in how you picture ancient Rome, hit follow. The archive's got a lot more like it buried in there. And down in the comments, tell me, did your textbook mention any of this? Or did you get the same paragraph about aqueducts that I did?